Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon from wherever you're joining us in the world today. And welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. Realist approaches seek to explain what works for whom, how, and in what context. And one of the ways to do that is by using this heuristic, this way of thinking of the context, mechanism, outcome, or in the short version, CMO configuration. And since the original CMO configuration, which we have an episode that you are more than welcome to look into to understand what it is in more detail, there has been variations and alternatives that add different factors and ways of thinking to this heuristic. But how does this impact your study? Is this acceptable? All of this and more in today's episode with two very special guests, Esther de Weger and Natascha van Vooren. Esther, Natascha, how are you?
Hi. We're fine, thank you.
Really nice to see you both. And as I say, I really enjoyed reading your paper about what's in a realist configuration and deciding what configuration to use. And this is exactly the point in the conversation of today. Hear your thoughts a little bit more around this heuristic, this way of thinking. How does it impact your study? And what should researchers choose? Because it seems like there has been so many different variations and so many different ways of thinking about this. And I'm really excited to hear your thoughts. Just before we do that, though, would you be happy to just share a little bit more around your background and your work in Realist so far? Esther, we'll start with you, for example.
Yeah, of course. Well, my background is mostly around public participation in complex societal issues, mostly focusing on the citizen perspective, but also about how we bring citizen perspectives with scientific perspectives and like policy perspectives together to make changes and improvements in those complex questions. And I really, yeah, experience started with Natascha. That's why we're here together as well. We were both PhDers. I started doing for my PhD CMO configurations, and we noticed the reason behind the paper. And it's really nice to hear that it's been useful for you. Why we kind of wrote it because we struggled with those kinds of questions that you highlighted here. So we've had lots of conversations during our PhD time with lots of chocolate, kind of trying to unpack, yeah, which sort of configurations and why are we, yeah, why we're using them. And I do currently still use them in my work as well. For one project, I'm using around community building, I'm using CMO, and for one new protocol that we're developing around domestic violence and like the cross collaboration around domestic violence and child abuse, we're looking to use ICMOs instead of the experience Natascha and I have for CMOs. So that's my background and current experiences. Yeah, so maybe I can take over. I'm Natascha. My background is in health sciences. And the last 9 years, I have done a lot of research in cross-sector collaboration for health and health systems. So it's about cross-sector collaborating between organizations in healthcare, social care, community services, public health, and how they can change from healthcare systems towards more health and well-being systems. So it's about the processes they encounter in their collaborations. And during those processes, we have used several realist evaluations. And I have used a strategy, context, mechanism, outcome configuration. So SCMOs, how we name them, which was very useful for us, but I will explain them later why. And by co-working with Esther, we have encountered like the different uses of the different configurations. So that prompted us to also discover what are those differences and how can we compare this use of different configurations in our researches.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, both. And I love that how you are, working together, as you say, probably some late nights, in some place in a dark desk, trying to think about these things together, which every PhD student can relate to, right? So I think that's fantastic how you've managed to go through this journey together of understanding this configurations and way of thinking. Just for the individuals that maybe have not just seen the episode on CMO configurations, would you be happy just to very quickly define what a CMO configuration is? This heuristic, this way of thinking that we have in realist research. Just very briefly, what is a CMO configuration?
Yeah, do you want me to start, Natasha? You can add and or correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, so when it was RE, when it was first developed, it was mostly CMO configurations were the method to express that causal explanation, those standard realist questions of why something happened or to what extent or for whom. CMO configurations were the method for expressing that causal explanation. So it's the heuristics around that. It is just a way of helping researchers unpack in an analytical and sort of thought deeper way of thinking about that causality. What intervention or action or what change in the context leads to which mechanism being triggered in a person or an organization, leading to what outcome. And traditionally it's been CMOs, but as we said before, there's been SCMOs now, or intervention, context, mechanism, outcomes, or even ICMOs, the A standing for actors. So I think what we notice when we're trying to develop our own thoughts on that is that trying to unpack that causality, there's lots of different factors that come into play for trying to see. And so it's not just context that impacts that causality, but it's also the actors acting in a certain context, leading to certain mechanisms. So the configurations and the different types of configurations are just different ways of unpacking that causality.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the value is and also really holding on to that causality. So how do those different CMO parts link to each other, and how can you explain that causality? I think that's a very important part in any version of configuration you encounter.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, both. I think what's important as well from this perspective is that it really is just a way of thinking and a heuristic tool that people shouldn't necessarily be too, oh my God, has to be completely fixed. And it's like a mathematical formula in a way, because some people can get a little bit stuck with that process. And is this way of thinking, as you say, in a generative way for generative causation, which means that it's not necessarily what we observe at the surface level that's causing things to happen, but this way of thinking in a deeper level. And that's the key, right? The link between these two. And not necessarily just listing them, but how it's like a domino effect. Within this context, it triggers or not a mechanism which causes or not a certain outcome. So that's a great definition. Thanks both. And as we mentioned, I mean, the first CMO configuration or this way of thinking, realistic evaluation, 1997, Pawson and Tilley have this initial, thesis of CMO, context, mechanism, outcome. But since then, there has been these alternatives. And as you've mentioned, you had some late nights talking together about which one to choose and which one to do and which one's the best. And so many thoughts that go into someone's mind when there's so many options available. So I guess what prompted you to explore these alternatives and what made you interested in all these different alternatives? And what were you trying to answer by trying to identify all these ways that CMO configurations have been theorized or have been proposed?
Yeah, so maybe that's the question I can take with why we use the SCMOs in our research. In our research, we looked at what can collaborative partnerships, so like the collaborations between all those different organizations, do to facilitate their process from healthcare systems to health and well-being systems. So what can facilitate that process? And we found it useful to get a better understanding of what works in which context and why and to which extent, but we really needed to get a better grasp of but what can you actually do? So what strategies can you implement? What things can you change in that context, and why do these work? Why do these work or not? To which outcome? So we really felt the need to explicitly extract that strategy and add that to the CMO configuration. So that is why we use SCMO configurations to make it more action oriented, also for the initiatives we were studying.
Yeah, and I think for that, the paper was based on a study that I did for my PhD, where I was much more focused on public participation as a mechanism of what makes citizens want to participate or participate in a certain way or not. And also from the system point of view, what makes it, certain professionals or policymakers able to kind of, we're having that discussion around the power dynamics, around can people take on that lay expert knowledge in the same way, kind of seeing it as equal, or even allowing citizens to have input on certain matters. So the focus was much more on the mechanism side of things. So what makes people want to participate in public participation or not? So I felt like for that study, adding the S or the I or even the A would detract from the focus on the mechanism side of things, I think. So, and that's what we write in our paper as well. When you first develop your research protocol, really think about the focus of your research question. Whereas Natascha was much more focused on, like you said, the strategies, interventions, and actions that people can take to make that broader systemic change. Whereas mine was much more focused on, okay, what drives people to want public participation or not, or pay lip service to it or not. So I think that the most important consideration when you start thinking about which configuration is really the focus and the research questions that you have at hand.
Fantastic. And that really reminds me, of what I hear you both speak and around the different study designs and outcomes and what you want to get from the research question into, the thought that again is placed in realist word of horses for courses, right? So like the appropriate approach to the appropriate design. And it seems like it may be a similar process here of all these different configuration times that you have available for you. What is it that you're trying to answer? And is this going to add value to that way of thinking and to that configuration? Will that be a fair reflection?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
I think it's useful. I think like the CMO is the basis, but if really your scope needs to explicate some additional factor, then that might be a reason to use like SCMOs or ICMOs or any other type of configuration. But I think it's really important that you firsthand think why should you add those explanatory factors, because it really influences the rest of your evaluation cycle itself as well.
Yeah, or even the configuration when you, as you said, it's not a list of things, but it has to be about that link, that causal link.
Yeah.
So I do remember chocolate fuel discussions that we had, especially around the mechanism, because like I follow more like Sonia Dawkins' description of mechanism, like mechanism, resource, and reasoning. Whereas if you take the strategy, how do I best explain it? I think if you add the S to the configuration, you take away some of the resource from the mechanism. So I think the way to, if you keep adding explanatory factors, as we call them, so it could be the S, could be the I, could be the A, you take away a little bit something from the mechanism. So mine, in my PhD, the mechanisms are very wordy because there was both a resource and a reasoning in that. But I think if you add the S, you still have that causal link, obviously, but I think where you place some of the things from what I would put in the mechanism for my PhD went into the S more. And I think in your case, in the study that you did, that definitely had value because you were focusing very much on that resource side of things. So I think just taking that out and being able to show commissioners and other like target audiences in that way, like, hey, this is what you can be doing in your own context, was very helpful. But I think, firstly, for mine, it would take away kind of like what happens in an individual, what happens in a system that makes them want to participate or not. So in that way, just to build on what you were saying, Natascha, it's not just like it definitely has an impact.
The interesting thing is what we did for this paper is that we cross-checked each other's researches. So we tried to use the SCMO in the research of what Esther did, and we tried to use the CMO in my research. So we've gone back to the transcripts of the interviews and looked at, with this data that we already have in those both researchers, can we make SCMOs in Esther, her research, and can we make CMOs vice versa? And what we saw is exactly what you're saying, Esther, is that you can create SCMOs also with the data of Esther, maybe to a lesser extent, but I will explain that later. But we found that the richness or the depth of the mechanisms, it still was there, but in a different way. Like the strategies also took a bit of that, but it was more difficult really connect to the scope of Esther research, to really deepen that mechanism and understand what citizens actually felt and how that really happens in the individual's perspective. Whereas when Esther tried to perform CMOs in my research, we found that there were a lot of CMOs configured in the whole of the transcripts, but we lacked the explicit focus of, but what can you actually do as a commissioner, as a policymaker, as whoever who reads this? What is it actually that you can do?
And from a practical point of view, what you said triggered like so many memories. What you were saying, like we were a little bit swimming in CMOs for your study as well. So you kind of, it's then I think one of the tricks with realist evaluations is that you can make a CMO out of almost anything, really. But the trick is to make the CMOs or SCMOs or the configurations to the extent that they answer the research questions and the aims and scope that you have. So what I noticed with making CMOs for your study was like, oh my God, I'm drowning in CMOs, and these aren't necessarily answering your research questions. It was like overwhelming. It was too much. I remember now.
That's what I'm hearing from your conversation just now, which is fascinating, is that just adding that one letter or that one different addition into that configuration can make such a difference in the way that you are in, that you're viewing that study or your analytical strategy or in the depth of the mechanism. And that's so interesting. And I want to dig a little bit more into that actually, because I think that is such a key area that listeners will be interested in, particularly when it comes to the design of their study and what they're looking, as you mentioned, in the questions they're trying to answer. How do you think that this different configuration time, so like SCMO or ICMOs, and you've mentioned already how the S may impact the M's, or you leave the M's into resource and reasoning, but how do these different configuration types may shape the way we generate and refine those program theories? Because it seems like such an important decision that you have to make and justify that as well.
Yeah, I've been thinking on that, and it's not an easy. I don't think there's an easy answer on it. Like I said, I'm now working on two research protocols. One's focused more on community building, where we are going to be using CMOs more, and one where we're going to use. Well, I'm not even sure if we're going to use ICMO or if we're using SCMO, because there's a difference between I and S, the I and the S as well. Partially for the reason of what you were saying around the program theories. I think your initial program theories have to be linked to the research questions and the scope and the focus that you're going to be applying and that you have. Yeah, so it's been a question that I've been, because you obviously asked us what and some of the things that we were going to be discussing today, and I'm still puzzling on that a little bit, because obviously it has an impact. And I think it also, because for our PhDs we used action-oriented guiding principles, which is slightly different from program theories already. So, one of the things that I would say, the reasons why we did the action oriented guiding principles was partially to give more concrete advice to our commissioners and to our target audiences like policymakers or citizens themselves. But I think maybe SCMOs or ICMOs lend themselves a little bit more towards those guiding principles than I would say CMOs. So even in the way that we think about program theories, there's already a choice to be made as well, I think. So I think there's so many different ways that it has an impact in the way that we have to think about it. I don't know, that doesn't answer fully your question yet, but I'm still grappling with it.
I think this was also a discussion during writing our paper,
Yeah.
that we couldn't fully grasp this specific part. How does it, and it's also stated in the paper, how does it actually affect refining your program theories? Because we had already made our program theories, focused on our scope, focused on our configuration. So it's really difficult to think back and think, what if we had used different configuration type? What would be the influence then? I really think that based on your scope and research question, that is the main focus of formulating your program theories, and that it might not be affected too much which configuration you use, but I think in then refining your program theory, so then how you state those program theories, like we used guiding principles in our papers, that is slightly different, because what Esther said, we focus more on what strategies will you name in those guiding principles. So our guiding principles were more, use this type of leadership because this and this and this. So it was more, this strategy you can use because then you get this outcome. And then the why wasn't stated this explicitly in the paper, but it was like explained in the text below. And I think with Esther, by focusing on the CMOs, the statements were more focused on, but you should on the why. Yeah. So it's important because, and then the why. So I think you have a little bit a different, maybe a different way of formulating those program theories, but like the density remains. So I think that's also important. Like the main causal generative relationship remains.
Yeah, so maybe listening to you now, Natascha, it's not necessarily the configurations that impact the way that you form, especially the initial program theories, but more your scope and your research questions and your aims. So like that's step one. And then step two is like, okay, you're formulating those initial program theories and then doing the configurations. And then indeed, I think where it starts impacting the choice and configuration, where it starts impacting those program theories, is within that refining stage. Now listening to you, I think that's how it works.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting with all those steps. And one other step at that refining stage that from my experience I found that it can impact as well as at the analysis stage. Because if you have that, say for instance, say an ICMO statement, you decide to go through that, and you have to focus on the actor and the for whom. So when you're looking at those transcripts, if you're using the interview transcripts, you go, okay, so this is someone that's been said by XYZ person, and that actor becomes now explicit in your mind. You're trying to identify those actors. Well, if you're using, say, a CMO or SCMO where the A is not involved, maybe you're not picking those up as explicitly. They're more implicit in your analysis. But if you really want to focus, as you say, in the for whom in your research question, and adding the actor also helps in your analysis to kind of really dig deep into where are these actors being impacted in this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think that's exactly what it is. But I also think that like it's also a step before. So it's not just the analysis that is impacted, but also data collection. Because when you're interviewing your participants, I was mostly focusing on which strategies did you use, what did you do, or what did you intend to do, which was explicitly asked about. And in the research of Esther, it wasn't explicitly asked about. So when we interchanged our use of configurations in each other's researches, it was really difficult to find the strategies in the study of Esther because she hadn't asked about it. So by choosing the type of configuration related to your scope, you also change the focus of your data collection. And you also need that to perform like a suitable data analysis, because if you only have data analysis focused on SCMOs, but you don't have like data collection also focusing on it, you will lack the strategies or the information that is needed to form those configurations.
Yeah, because Manzano's paper, The Arts of Realist Interviewing, clearly highlights how it influences your topic guide. The realist lens, how it should influence your topic guide. And I think you're absolutely right, Natascha, like depending on the focus that you have. I mean, neither of us explicitly asked after actors, for example. Yeah, agreed.
I love that. I guess that the summary of the conversation, which is a very realist answer, is it depends. And it depends on the choices that you're making and what you're doing that is going to, there's no recipe in a way of, which one to choose, etc. As long as it's aligned and justified and transparent, and that your data collection, analysis, program theory refinement, it's all aligned with those questions and those elements that you're adding in that configuration. Moving on from that, because I also know that, there's many that are being developed. I'm sure there'll be more that will come in the literature as in the next few years. And people may think, oh, maybe we need to add some more things in here as well. Because it's super important not only focus on the intervention and the strategy, but maybe we need to focus more on the different kinds of contexts. So, how mechanism has been broken down into responsive reasoning. Maybe we have to break down context. Maybe there's different outcomes. But from that perspective, are there any risks in adding too many explanatory elements? If you start adding too many letters, or if you start adding too many different elements in that configuration, what could be the risks of that? Could it potentially lose clarity or focus, or indeed could it add richness to the analysis? What are your thoughts?
I think the risk that you need to mitigate and manage is diluting that causal link. Like if you start adding too many letters or factors, I think the risk that you need to mitigate is that each of the so like you said, it can be a list. It has to be linked. And I think by adding more factors, you run that risk of creating lists instead of links, if that makes sense. So I would say that's one risk. And the other risk is that you talked about transparency, and I was just reflecting on that. And I think transparency means not just the reasons why you choose the configurations, but also how do you define and operationalize each of the letters in that configuration. So I think maybe I'm already stating how you start mitigating that risk of diluting the link, but I think that's one of the things that we need to start unpacking together and start agreeing with each other a little bit more on. I even just said like, well, I'm considering for this new research project that I'm doing, am I doing an S or an I? And then I start going back into that, oh, what's the difference between the strategy and and intervention? And I think that's just one of the ways that you can start mitigating, that you're not just transparent about which and why the type of configuration you use, but also how do you define and operationalize each of those conceptual factors, and then how do you see the causal link between each of those factors. So that would be my take on that.
Yeah, and since there's no go-to definition of this is a strategy and this is an intervention or
Exactly.
this is how we define actors, you really need to explain what you see as intervention and how you see that link to strategy or sorry, context, mechanism, outcome, etc. So
Exactly.
you really need to define it over and over again, I think,
Yeah.
to explain that. Yeah.
As you mentioned as well, because not everyone at the moment maybe completely understands the realist world so far, or it may be the first realist evaluation that they're maybe peer reviewing, or if it's commissioned. So really giving those definitions as well
Mhm.
of the element can be so important. I completely agree with that. And just to be super clear from the start that if this is how we're defining the mechanism or the strategy of the intervention or XYZ, that across the paper, then okay, I know what they mean by that, particularly for individuals who may not be honed with the realist approach.
Yeah. And it really sounds logical, but it's not that common in all articles, because we also did a review of the articles, and it really lacked the explanation of why do you use those additional explanatory factors. How do you define them? We really had to search for that explanation. So I would say that that's an important recommendation for researchers to explain and to be transparent about it.
And I would just add, it's not just for people beginning with realist evaluations. Even for me, dipping back into the realist evaluation for completely different types of research studies, it just helps you stay fresh and on top of it. Like for me, it stays a struggle. And you said earlier, there's a balance to be struck between being too formulaic, like this is CMO, this is the link, and enabling that reflexivity that we all need to have as researchers anyway, and not just for beginners in realist evaluation, but and anytime you start a new research project, just doing that own reflexive work yourself is just so important. And of course, in papers, it's really helpful with the Ramesses guidelines and standards. It's really helpful that if we keep writing and being transparent for each other, but we also need to keep doing the work ourselves, I think.
Fantastic. I think that's so important to recognize that it's not a finished product, all of this, and
Absolutely not.
things continue to evolve in our understanding and the realist evaluation and synthesis is pretty new when it comes to the world. We're reaching nearly its 30-year anniversary in 2 years' time. And so there are all these questions and all these developments and all these areas will only and develop as more people get involved, learn, and we start to ask the questions like you're doing around CMO configurations. I guess through our conversation as well, you've given some really good piece of advice already. So, for example, the one just now defining and being very clear into what each of the letters mean. Also, at the start, you were talking around the choice based on the question that you're trying to answer, or the design or the topic. But if you were to give 3 pieces of advice to evaluators that maybe are struggling which one to choose. There's so many options. There's so many things to do here. What would be the top 3 things? They're going to leave this podcast and they're going to go to their day-to-day lives or day-to-day jobs or anything along that. Like, no pressure. What would be the top 3 things that you would say, okay, when you're choosing your realist configuration, you should?
On an individual level, be kind to yourself. It's not necessarily, we've always said it's not necessarily the easiest way to analyze and grapple with research and data. So allow yourself that extra time that you would normally standard evaluations. So allow yourself that time to grapple with these questions as well. So that's more on an individual level. Like I said, it doesn't matter if you've been doing it 1 year or 10 years, you keep grappling and reflecting on these sorts of things. So that's my first piece of advice. And I think more methodologically speaking, think about, I think the most important thing that Natascha already mentioned, I think the CMO configuration should remain as the basis, but then consider, based on your research questions and scope and focus, is one or two extra letters or explanatory factors, are they necessary to really hone in and start refining your program theories? Yeah, that would be my first piece of advice, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing. Like, what is your scope, and how do these configurations relate to the scope? I think a more general advice would be, but that's in any kind of configuration. What is the link between the different explanatory factors? So CMO, but either SCMO, ICMO, anyhow. What is the link between those? And clearly define and state how you see that link, and how you define that link, and how you define that additional explanatory factor. And another advice
Try to
is more
visualize it maybe as well. Try to visualize for yourself that causal link as well. And like if you use CMO as a basis, visualize what if and when an additional factor would be helpful or not in explaining that causality. I think like as soon as you try to visualize it, I think you can more easily try and see if an extra letter would help or not in explaining that causality.
Yeah, and I think also be aware of the influence it has on your whole research cycle. So it does influence your data collection. It does influence your data analysis. It's even a question in your data collection if you are able to already ask for example, in my case, about strategies, because you can also have a context in which there are no strategies implemented yet because it's early stages of some intervention or anything that is implemented. So then strategies would be quite unuseful in that case because it's too early. So really think about how does it affect your data collection, your data analysis, your refinement of your program theories. I think that's also an important recommendation.
And that reflexivity throughout that process, I think, as well. Allow the time and space to keep reflecting on that process.
Love that. Self-care, scope, make those links, be reflexive.
Perfect.
There we go. Happy days. In 4 words, you can pick your configuration now.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Happy days.
Easy as that, yeah.
We've solved the problem. Natascha, Esther, I've really enjoyed our conversation. It's been so interesting, and to hear both, and to really try to grapple with these questions. And the answer really is that there's no mathematical answer to this. It's more thinking and making those methodological decisions as you're going through the different configurations. The other thing I would say is read about them. So, read the papers that have introduced the different configurations. So read about the ICMO statement paper, read about how reasoning and resources have been separated. Of course, read the original Pawson and Tilley to the CMOs to really understand the rationale between all of those, to give you an informed decision as you're going through those. As you're going through that, then that can give you some good decisions as well. But I think it's been fantastic. I really thank you both for coming to speak with us today. And for those of you listening as well, thank you so much for joining another episode of the Realist Lens. I hope it's given you some good insights as you're going to pick your configurations, or indeed if you're in the middle of your study and thinking around your next project, around all the configurations that are available. And Natascha, Esther, thank you so much for your time.
So much. Bye-bye.
Take care.